false representation time and time again, it just makes it that much more deliberate and onerous. The President could have presented evidence in the Judiciary Committee. He chose not to, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason why the witnesses they've talked about aren't material witnesses. They don't go to the question of whether the President withheld the aid for this corrupt purpose. They don't go to any of that because they have no witnesses to absolve the President on the facts. You should want to see these documents. You should want to see them. You should want to know what these private emails and text messages have to say. If you're going to make a decision about the President's guilt or innocence, if you're going to make a decision about whether he should be removed from office, you should want to see what these documents say. Now, if you don't care, if you've made up your mind that he's the president of my party or for whatever reason, I'm not interested. And what's more, I don't really want the country to see this. Well, that's a wholly different matter. But that's not what your oath requires. It's not what your oath requires. The oath requires you to do impartial justice, which means to see the evidence. To see the evidence. That's all we're asking. Just don't blind yourself to the evidence. It's just, I yield back.
Thank you. The Majority Leader is recognized.
I send a motion to the desk to table the amendment and ask for the ayes and nays.
The question is on the motion to table. Is there sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. No. Mr. Barrasso. Aye. Mr. Bennett. No. Mrs. Blackburn. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Booker. No. Mr. Bozeman. Aye. Mr. Braun. Aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Aye. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Inze. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 53, the nays are 47. The amendment is tabled. The Democratic leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, I send an amendment to the desk to subpoena certain documents and records from the State Department, and I ask that it be read.
The clerk will read the amendment.
The senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, proposes an amendment, number 1285. At the appropriate place in the resolving clause, insert the following section. Notwithstanding any other provision of this resolution pursuant to Rules 5 and 6 of the Rules of Procedures and Practice in the Senate when sitting in impeachment trials, 1, the Chief Justice of the United States, through the Secretary of the Senate, shall issue a subpoena to the Secretary of Senate commanding him to produce, for the time period from January 1, 2019 to the present, all documents, communications, and other records within the possession, custody, or control of the Department of State, referring or relating to A, all meetings and calls between President Trump and the President of Ukraine, including documents, communications, and other records related to the scheduling of, preparation for, and follow-up from the President's April 21 and July 25, 2019 telephone calls, as well as the President's September 25, 2019 meeting with the President of Ukraine in New York. B, the actual or potential suspension, withholding, delaying, freezing, or releasing of United States foreign assistance, military assistance, or security assistance of any kind to Ukraine, including but not limited to the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, USAI, and foreign military financing, FMF, including but not limited to all communications with the White House, Department of Defense, and the Office of Management and Budget, as well as the Ukrainian government's knowledge prior to August 28, 2019, of any actual or potential suspension, withholding, delaying, freezing, or releasing of United States foreign assistance to Ukraine, including all meetings, calls, or other engagements with Ukrainian officials regarding potential or actual suspensions, holds, or delays in United States assistance to Ukraine. C, all documents, communications, notes, and other records created or received by Secretary Michael R. Pompeo, Counselor T. Ulrich Breckbull, former Special Representative for Ukraine Negotiations Ambassador Kurt Volker, Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent, then United States Embassy in Ukraine Chargé d'Affaires William B. Taylor, and Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland, and other State Department officials relating to efforts to 1. Solicit, request, demand, induce, persuade, or coerce Ukraine to conduct or announce investigations. 2. Schedule, cancel, or withhold a White House meeting for Ukraine's president. Or 3. Hold and then release military and other security assistance to Ukraine. D. Any meetings or proposed meetings at or involving the White House that relate to Ukraine, including but not limited to 1. President Zelensky's inauguration on May 20, 2019 in Kiev, Ukraine, including but not limited to President Trump's decision not to attend, to ask Vice President Pence to lead the delegation, directing Vice President Pence not to attend, and the subsequent decision about the composition of the delegation of the United States. 2. A meeting at the White House on or around May 23, 2019, involving, among others, President Trump, then Special Representative for Ukraine Negotiations Ambassador Kurt Volker, then Energy Secretary Rick Perry, and United States Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland, as well as any private meetings or conversations with those individuals before or after the larger meeting. 3. Meetings at the White House on or about July 10, 2019, involving Ukrainian officials Andriy Yermak and Alexander Danieluk, and United States government officials, including but not limited to then National Security Advisor John Bolton, Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and Ambassador Sondland, to include at least a meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office and a subsequent meeting in the wardroom. 4. A meeting at the White House on or around August 30, 2019, involving President Trump, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and Secretary of Defense Mark Esper. 5. A planned meeting, later canceled in Warsaw, Poland, on or around September 1, 2019, between President Trump and President Zelensky, and subsequently attended by Vice President Pence. And 6. A meeting at the White House on or around September 11, 2019, involving President Trump, Vice President Pence, and Mr. Mulvaney, concerning the lifting of the hold on security assistance for Ukraine. E. All communications, including but not limited to WhatsApp or text messages on private devices between current or former State Department officials or employees, including but not limited to Secretary Michael R. Pompeo, Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland, Ambassador Taylor, and Deputy Assistant Secretary Kent, and the following: President Zelensky, Andriy Yermak, or individuals or entities associated with or acting in any capacity as a representative, agent, or proxy for President Zelensky before and after his election. F. All records specifically identified by witnesses in the House of Representatives impeachment inquiry that memorialize key events or concerns, and any records reflecting an official response thereto, including but not limited to 1. On August 29, 2019, cable sent by Ambassador Taylor to Secretary Pompeo. 2. An August 16, 2019, memorandum to file written by Deputy Assistant Secretary Kent. And 3, a September 15, 2019 memorandum to file written by Deputy Assistant Secretary Kent. G, all meetings or calls, including but not limited to all requests for or records of meetings or telephone calls, scheduling items, calendar entries, State Department visitor records, and email or text messages using personal or work-related devices between or among, 1, current or former State Department officials or employees, including but not limited to Secretary Michael R. Pompeo, Ambassador Volker, and Ambassador Sondland, and 2, Rudolph W. Giuliani, Victoria Tensing, or Joseph DeGeneva, and H, the curtailment or recall of former United States Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Masha Yovanovitch, for the United States Embassy in Kiev, including credible threat reports against her and any protective security measures taken in response. And 2, the Sergeant-at-Arms is authorized to utilize the services of the Deputy Sergeant-at-Arms or any other employee of the Senate in serving the subpoena authorized to be issued by this section.
Mr. Chief Justice,
The Majority Leader is recognized.
I now ask for a brief 10-minute recess before the parties are recognized to debate the Schumer amendment. At the end of the debate time, I'll again move to table the amendment as the timing of these votes are specified in the underlying resolution. So I ask consent that the Senate stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Without objection, the Senate is in recess.